Shield Wall's End. On September 25th, 1066, Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, stood on the eastern bank of the River Derwent in East Yorkshire, England, and prepared to fight for a throne he had spent years claiming was rightfully his. Harald Sigurdsson had lived a warrior's life long before he ever set his sights on England. As a young man, he had served in the Byzantine Varangian Guard, the elite Norse mercenary force that protected the Eastern Roman emperors. He had fought across the Mediterranean, campaigning in Sicily, Bulgaria, and along the Anatolian coast. He had accumulated wealth, military experience, and a reputation that stretched from Constantinople back to Scandinavia. By the time he returned to the north and eventually seized the Norwegian throne, he was already one of the most battle-hardened commanders in the known world. His nickname, Hardrada, meaning hard ruler, was not given lightly. He had ruled Norway with force and authority for more than 2 decades before the events of 1066 placed him on English soil. His claim to the English throne was complex. He argued it derived from an earlier agreement between the kings of Norway and Denmark, and from his position as the successor to that lineage. When the English king Edward the Confessor died at the beginning of 1066, Harold saw his opportunity. He was not alone in seeing it. Harold Godwinson had already taken the English crown. William of Normandy was preparing to cross the Channel with his own claim. Harald Hardrada moved first. He assembled a large fleet and sailed for England with his ally Tostig Godwinson, the estranged brother of the English king. They landed in the north, moved up the Humber estuary, and defeated a combined English force at the Battle of Gate Fulford on September 20th, 1066. York, the great northern city, submitted. The campaign appeared to be unfolding well. Harold's forces were large, experienced, and victorious. He had every reason to believe the momentum was his. In the days following Gate Fulford, the Norse army moved with a degree of confidence that came naturally after a decisive victory. A portion of the force was left with the fleet at Rickle, several miles south of York. Much of the army's heavier armor and equipment stayed there as well. On the morning of September 25th, Harold moved the bulk of his force to Stamford Bridge, a crossing point on the River Derwent east of York, where he expected to collect hostages from the surrounding region as a show of submission from the English north. It was administrative work following a military success. The temperature was reportedly warm for late September. The men had not been expecting a fight that day. What they did not know was that Harold Godwinson had marched his army north from London at a speed that was, by any contemporary measure, extraordinary. The English king had received word of the Norse landing and had driven his forces north with urgency. He reached York and then pushed on toward Stamford Bridge without pause. The approach of the English army was not detected by Norse scouts in time to mount a coordinated response. The English force arrived at Stamford Bridge and found the Norse army divided by the river. Part of the Norwegian force was still on the western bank. The eastern bank held the larger contingent where Harald Hardrada commanded. A famous account in the saga tradition preserved in Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla describes a single Norse warrior holding the bridge itself against the English advance long enough for the eastern force to form up, eventually cut down only when an English soldier came beneath the bridge by boat and struck him from below. Whether this account reflects a literal event or a later embellishment, what is confirmed is that the English army crossed and engaged. Harald Hardrada's forces formed a shield wall on the eastern bank. They were experienced soldiers, even caught without their full armor, even surprised. They were not easily broken. Harold himself fought at the front of his force, as was the expectation of a Norse king in battle. He was tall, he was visible, he was a target. Sometime during the early fighting at Stamford Bridge, Harald Hardrada was struck by an arrow. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the Heimskringla both record the cause of death. The arrow struck him in the throat. The sequence in which this happened, beat by beat, is described across multiple sources. The Norse shield wall was engaged. The fighting was close and brutal. Harold was in the front line, fighting, commanding, visible among his own men. An arrow came from the English lines. It struck his throat. He fell. He did not survive the wound. An arrow to the throat in the conditions of an 11th century battle, with no surgical intervention available on the field, was not survivable. The wound was confirmed in both the primary chronicle record and the later saga tradition as the cause of death. The Norse forces at Stamford Bridge did not immediately collapse after his fall. According to the sources, Harald Godwinson reportedly offered the Norwegian forces the chance to withdraw. The offer was not taken. The battle continued. Tostig Godwinson was killed in the same engagement. The Norse force eventually broke. Reinforcements arrived from the fleet at Rickal under the command of Eystein Ori, but they arrived too late and too exhausted from the march to turn the tide. The relief force was destroyed. The Norwegian army that had arrived in England with such force, that had won at Gate Fulford only 5 days earlier, was effectively eliminated at Stamford Bridge. Of the large fleet that had carried the invasion force to England, the sources record that only a fraction of the ships were needed to carry the survivors home. Harald Hardrada was pronounced dead on the field at Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066. The cause of death was an arrow wound to the throat. He was approximately 50 years old. His death marked the end of the serious Viking claim to the English throne, and, in the view of many historians, the effective close of the Viking Age as a period of Norse military expansion into the British Isles. Pit of Serpents. Ragnar Lothbrok, chieftain, raider, and one of the most recorded figures in the Norse saga tradition, met his end in a pit of venomous snakes, in the custody of a Northumbrian king who had captured him following a failed raid on English soil. Ragnar's origins are debated by historians. The sources that describe him, primarily the Ragnar saga Lothbrok and the Krakumal, present a man who raided across Francia and England, who fought his way into legend, and who fathered sons who would become some of the most feared warriors of the 9th century. His name appears in Frankish annals in connection with raids on Paris. His sons are recorded in both Norse and Anglo-Saxon sources as leaders of the Great Heathen Army. Whether Ragnar Lothbrok was a single historical individual, a composite of several Viking leaders, or a legendary figure built on a historical core is a question scholars continue to debate. What the sources consistently record is the manner of his death, and it is recorded across multiple texts, with enough agreement to establish it as the fixed endpoint of his story in the tradition. Ragnar was not a man who stopped raiding as his fame grew. The accounts of his life describe a pattern of continued expansion, of pushing into territories and against enemies who had every reason to resist him. His raid on Northumbria, which appears in the saga tradition as the final campaign of his life, was not the act of a cautious man hedging his risks. He went with a small force. The sources differ on exactly why, whether from overconfidence, from a desire to prove something, or simply from the circumstances of the campaign. But the outcome is consistent across the records. The raid failed. Ragnar was captured. King Ella of Northumbria held him. The execution that followed was not a quick or merciful one. The saga tradition records that Ella had Ragnar thrown into a pit filled with venomous snakes. This method of execution, while not corroborated by contemporary Frankish or Anglo-Saxon chronicle sources, is attested across multiple Norse texts and is the consistent account of the tradition. The Krakumal, a skaldic poem attributed to Ragnar and presented as the words he spoke as he died in the snake pit, preserves what the tradition claims were his final statements. The poem is composed as a death song, a recounting of battles fought and enemies faced, moving toward an acceptance of death and an anticipation of the warrior's afterlife. The poem includes the line, often rendered in translation, that the little pigs would grunt if they knew what the old boar suffers, understood as a warning directed toward his sons. The Krakumal is attributed to Ragnar in the saga tradition. It is a literary text and is presented here as such. The snakes in the pit, according to the account, would have caused multiple strikes. The death would not have been immediate. The poem's framing suggests a duration, a consciousness maintained long enough to compose or recite verse. What can be confirmed from the text is that the tradition records him as dying in the pit of the snake bites after a period of time sufficient for the attributed poem to be spoken. His sons learned of his death. The saga tradition records that the account of his death, including the attributed last words from the Krakumal, was brought to them. Their response was documented, not only in Norse sources, but in sources closer to the events themselves. The Great Heathen Army, led by Ragnar's sons, including Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, landed in England in 865. The revenge campaign had begun. Ragnar Lothbrok died in the snake pit at the order of King Ella of Northumbria. The cause of death, as recorded in the saga tradition, was the bites of venomous snakes. The year is not precisely confirmed, but is placed by most scholars in the mid-9th century. His sons would return to England, and Ella would not survive their arrival. Blood Eagle's Mark. King Ella of Northumbria was killed by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok in 867 following the fall of York to the Great Heathen Army, in an act the Norse sources describe as ritual vengeance for Ragnar's death. Ella had been king of Northumbria at a moment when the political situation in the north of England was already unstable. Northumbrian politics in the 9th century were characterized by internal conflict, rival claimants, and a kingdom that had difficulty sustaining unified resistance against external pressure. The Norse sources do not give Ella an extensive biography. He appears primarily in the record as the man who killed Ragnar Lothbrok, and who subsequently faced the consequences of that act. The Great Heathen Army arrived in England in 865. The force was large enough that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which generally maintained a factual and restrained tone, recorded it as a Great Heathen Army, a designation that conveyed scale. The sons of Ragnar, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, Björn Ironside, and others are named in the sources as the leadership of this force. The stated purpose, preserved in the Norse tradition, was revenge for Ragnar's death. The army moved north. York, the great Northumbrian city, fell to the Norse forces in 866. The city had walls. The Norse took it anyway, on November 1st, 866, a date the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records with specificity. The following year, 867, an English force attempted to retake York. The assault failed. The sources record significant English casualties. Ella was captured. What happened next is described in the Norse saga sources and in certain later chronicles. The method of Ella's killing, the blood eagle, is one of the most discussed and debated subjects in the study of Norse history. The procedure, as described in the sources, involved opening the back, separating the ribs from the spine, and drawing out the lungs to create the appearance of wings. It is described in the Ragnar's saga and in other texts as the punishment inflicted on Ella as vengeance for the snake pit. Historians have debated this account extensively. Some scholars have argued that the blood eagle was a literal ritual execution practiced in certain contexts. Others have argued that the descriptions in the sources are literary constructions, symbolic representations of vengeance rather than accounts of a procedure actually performed. The academic discussion has not reached a settled conclusion. What is confirmed is that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records Ella's death in 867, following the Norse capture of York and the failed English counterattack. The manner of that death is what the Norse sources claim. The blood eagle, whether performed literally or as described symbolically in the tradition, is attributed in the sources to Ivar the Boneless, who is presented as the primary architect of the revenge campaign. The act, in the saga tradition, was understood as the completion of a specific debt, the repayment of a specific cruelty with a specific answer. After Ella's death, the great heathen army did not withdraw from England. They continued their campaign, moving south and east, eventually establishing control over large portions of northern and eastern England. The kingdom of Northumbria, already weakened, did not recover its pre-invasion form. The Norse presence in the north became permanent enough that a distinct region, the Danelaw, would develop in the following decades. King Ella of Northumbria died in 867. The cause of death, as recorded in the Norse saga tradition, was the blood eagle, performed as an act of vengeance for the death of Ragnar Lothbrok. The historical record confirms his death following the Norse capture of York. The precise method, as described in the sagas, remains a subject of scholarly debate. Axe at Clontarf. Brian Boru, High King of Ireland, was killed at the Battle of Clontarf on April 23, 1014, in his tent. After the Norse-Leinster alliance, his forces had spent the day defeating had already been broken in the field. Brian Boru had spent decades working to consolidate power in Ireland. He had risen from a regional kingship in Munster to the high kingship of the entire island, a position he held through a combination of military success, political negotiation, and the systematic elimination or submission of rival powers. He was not a young man by 1014. Contemporary and near-contemporary sources place him in his early 70s, at the time of Clontarf. He had fought his way to the top of Irish political life and had maintained that position long enough to reshape the structure of Irish kingship. The coalition that assembled against him at Clontarf was substantial. Sigurd the Stout, Earl of Orkney, had brought Norse forces from Scotland. Broder of Man, a Norse warlord operating out of the Isle of Man, brought additional fighters. The King of Leinster provided an Irish contingent that opposed Brian's dominance. The alliance was assembled over the preceding months, and both sides had time to prepare for what they understood would be a significant engagement. The battle took place on Good Friday, April 23, 1014, on the ground north of Dublin near the estuary of the River Tolka. Brian Boru did not personally fight. This is confirmed across the sources, including the Cogad's Gaedal Regalave, the most detailed contemporary Irish account of the battle. His age, and according to some sources, a religious observance of the holy day, meant he remained at the rear of his army. He was in his tent. He was attended by a small number of men. The fighting took place without him in the field. The battle went against the Norse-Leinster alliance. Sigurd the Stout was killed during the fighting. The Norse forces, finding their position deteriorating, began to break toward their ships. The retreat became a rout in places. The Irish forces pursued. By the standards of the engagement, the victory for Brian's army was clear. Broder of Man had survived the initial fighting. As his forces collapsed and the retreat toward the coast began, Broder did not go directly to the ships. He moved through the ground between the battle and Brian's position. The Kogad Gaedal Regalave and later accounts, including in Njal's saga, record that Broder penetrated to Brian's tent. The king was there with minimal protection. What happened in the tent is recorded in the sources as a direct killing. Brian Boru was killed by Broder. Brian's attendants and nearby men responded. Broder was captured. The sources record that he was killed by Brian's men shortly after the killing, though the manner of his death is described differently across the various accounts. His capture and death following Brian's killing are confirmed across the tradition. The Battle of Clontarf was over. Brian's son Mershad had also been killed during the fighting, as had a significant number of the Irish nobility. The victory was real, but costly in a way that made the aftermath complicated. Brian Boru had broken the Norse-Leinster coalition. He did not live to consolidate what that victory meant. Brian Boru was pronounced dead at the Battle of Clontarf on April 23, 1014. He was killed in his tent by Broder of Man. Broder was captured by Brian's men and killed shortly after. Orkney's last Earl. Sigurd the Stout, Earl of Orkney, died at the Battle of Clontarf on April 23, 1014, carrying his own raven banner after every man assigned to bear it had already fallen. Sigurd Lodvison had ruled the Orkney earldom at the height of its power. The Orkneyinga saga and other sources describe him as one of the most significant Norse lords of his era, a man whose control extended across the Northern Isles and into parts of northern Scotland. He had fought against the Irish and Scottish powers along the coasts he controlled, had raided, taxed, and administered an earldom that operated as a genuine political entity with its own interests and relationships, separate from the Norwegian crown. He was experienced in warfare and understood the stakes of military alliances. His decision to join the coalition against Brian Boru at Clontarf was not made lightly. The sources indicate he was reluctant until a specific inducement was offered. The Njal saga records that Gormle, the estranged former wife of Brian Boru, approached Sigurd and offered him Ireland and her hand in marriage if he would come and fight against Brian. The account of this negotiation is preserved in the saga tradition. Sigurd agreed, assembled his forces from Orkney and the surrounding territories, and sailed for Ireland. The Raven Banner was Sigurd's battle standard. The Orkneyinga saga and Njal saga both describe it as a banner of significant power in the Norse tradition, woven by his mother, said to bring victory to the army it led and death to the man who bore it. Whether this attributed property was believed before Clontarf or became part of the banner's legend in retrospect is not possible to determine from the sources. What the sources record is what happened to it during the battle. On the morning of April 23, 1014, Sigurd's force took the field as part of the Norse-Leinster coalition. The battle was large. Both sides committed significant forces. The fighting along the banks of the Tolka was intense and extended across much of the day. At some point during the engagement, the man carrying Sigurd's raven banner was killed. A second man took it up. He was killed. According to the sources, this pattern continued, with successive bearers falling until no one was willing to take the standard. Sigurd took the banner himself. The saga account records this as his decision, made when he could not find a man willing to carry it. He placed it under his cloak or attached it to himself so that it could not be dropped even if he fell. He was killed in the fighting at Clontarf. The sources confirm his death at the battle. The exact weapon or individual who struck him is not recorded in the sources with enough specificity to state here. What is confirmed is that he died in the field on April 23, 1014, during the Battle of Clontarf. His death, coming alongside the deaths of other Norse commanders, contributed to the collapse of the Norse-Leinster coalition's ability to continue fighting. The forces began to retreat toward the ships. For Sigurd the Stout, there was no retreat. Sigurd the Stout, Earl of Orkney, died at the Battle of Clontarf on April 23, 1014. He was killed in the field during the fighting. The banner he had taken up himself was with him when he fell. Longship, last voyage. Olaf Tryggvason, king of Norway, disappeared at the Battle of Svolder in the year 1000, when his flagship was overrun by a coalition fleet and he jumped into the sea and was never seen again. Olaf Tryggvason had come to the Norwegian throne through one of the more dramatic sequences of events in the Norse saga record. He had spent years in exile, had fought and raided across the British Isles and along the European coasts, had converted to Christianity in England, and had returned to Norway to seize the kingdom by force in 995. Once in power, he pursued the Christianization of Norway and the surrounding Norse territories with a forcefulness that made him enemies both among those who resisted the new faith and among the political powers who saw his growing influence as a threat. By the year 1000, he had accumulated enough enemies to constitute a formidable coalition. Sweyn Forkbeard, king of Denmark, had clear reasons to oppose Olaf's power in the region. Olaf of Sweden aligned with him. Eirik Jarl of Lod, whose family had previously held power in Norway before Olaf Tryggvason's arrival, had every interest in removing the man who had displaced his father. These three parties coordinated their forces and positioned themselves in the waters of what the sources describe as Svolder, a location that historians continue to debate, with candidates ranging from the western Baltic to the waters off Rügen. Olaf Tryggvason was sailing with his fleet from the east when the ambush was set. The sources in the Heimskringla and elsewhere describe the coalition ships lying in wait, watching Olaf's fleet pass, and then moving to close off his escape. By the time Olaf understood what was facing him, his position was compromised. He had a fleet. It was not large enough for what he was now confronting. His flagship was called the Long Serpent. The Heimskringla describes it at length. It was, by the account of the sources, one of the largest ships of its era, a vessel constructed specifically to project power and signal the wealth and ambition of the Norwegian king. It had a deep hull, a long keel, a large crew capacity. On the day of Svolder, it was the centerpiece of the Norse formation and the primary target of the coalition's attack. The battle was fought ship to ship, the attacking fleet working through Olaf's formation from the smaller vessels toward the Long Serpent. The Heimskringla reconstructs this sequence in detail. Each of Olaf's ships was boarded or driven off in turn, the coalition forces isolating the Long Serpent progressively until it stood alone against the combined fleet. Olaf's crew fought from the Long Serpent's deck as the coalition ships pressed in on every side. The defenders fell, the attackers boarded. At the point when the Long Serpent's defense had been broken and the ship was being overrun, Olaf Tryggvason jumped into the sea. The sources record this. Some later accounts describe him sinking beneath the waves with his shield over him, or describe attempts to pull him out that he evaded. What every account confirms is that he went into the water and did not come back up. He was not recovered. No body was found. His disappearance from the historical record is confirmed from this point forward. A tradition exists in some saga sources that he survived, swam to shore, eventually made his way to a monastery and lived out his life as a monk. The mainstream historical treatment considers him to have died at Svolder. No contemporary source records his survival. The coalition absorbed his kingdom. Sweyn Forkbeard and his allies divided the Norwegian territories among themselves. The Long Serpent, that centerpiece of his power, was gone. Olaf Tryggvason is presumed to have died at the Battle of Svolder in the year 1000. The cause of death is presumed to be drowning. No body was recovered. He was never seen again. Spear through Raven. Eric Bloodaxe, former king of Norway and the last Viking ruler of Jorvik, was killed at Stainmore in 954. Ambushed while moving through the north of England alongside his son and his brother. Eric Haraldsson had the kind of name that required explanation. The appellation Bloodaxe, which appears in the saga tradition, is associated in the sources with his willingness to eliminate rivals, including his own brothers, in the process of attempting to secure the Norwegian throne. He was the son of Harald Fairhair, the king credited in the Norse tradition with first unifying Norway, and had been designated as his heir. His rule in Norway was brief and contentious. He was expelled by his brother Håkon, who had spent time at the English court and returned with enough support to displace him. Eric did not retire from politics after his expulsion from Norway. He found his way to England, specifically to the north, where the Viking kingdom of Jorvik, centered on the city of York, had maintained a distinct political existence under a series of Norse rulers. He became king of Jorvik, though his tenure there was also unstable. He was expelled and returned again. The political dynamics of 10th century Northumbria were not hospitable to any ruler trying to maintain authority, and Eric's position was constantly contested by English kings to the south and by local powers in the north. By 954, his grip on Jorvik had become untenable. The English king Edred had spent years applying pressure to Northumbria, and the Northumbrian political establishment had shifted away from supporting Eric. He was expelled from York for a final time. He moved north and west, with a force that included his son Harekk and his brother Ragnald. The region of Stainmore sits on the high ground that now marks the border between Cumbria and North Yorkshire. It was then, as now, a place of exposed moorland and difficult terrain, a crossing point on the routes through the north. Roger of Wendover and later chronicle sources implicate Oswulf, the High Reeve of Bamberg, in what happened at Stainmore. The sources describe a betrayal, a man who was supposed to be engaged with Eric in some capacity, and who instead arranged for his killing. The precise sequence of the ambush is not recorded in the sources with enough detail to reconstruct beat by beat. What is confirmed is that Eric was attacked at Stainmore in 954. His son Harekk was killed in the same engagement. His brother Ragnald was killed in the same engagement. The sources are consistent that all three died there. Eric Bloodaxe's death at Stainmore ended more than simply one man's political ambitions. It ended Viking Jorvik. The kingdom that had existed under Norse rule in various forms since the late 9th century was absorbed into the English kingdom. Edred, the English king who had worked toward this outcome, consolidated control over Northumbria. The long process by which Scandinavian political power in England was reduced and eventually eliminated had reached a key point. Eric Bloodaxe was killed at Stainmore in 954. His son Harekk and his brother Ragnald were killed with him. The cause of death is not specified in the sources beyond the fact of the ambush. His death ended Norse rule over Jorvik. Exile's final shore. Eric the Red, the founder of the Norse colonies in Greenland, died in Greenland around the year 1003 from an epidemic illness that arrived with his son's fleet returning from Vinland. Eric Thorvaldsson had spent his adult life being expelled from places and founding new ones in response. He was exiled from Norway following a killing. He settled in Iceland. He was exiled from Iceland for 3 years following further killings, the result of ongoing disputes with neighboring families that escalated past the point where Icelandic law could contain him. He used those 3 years of exile to sail west, to explore the large landmass that others had glimpsed but not settled, and to give it the name that the Grenlandinga saga suggests was partly a marketing choice, Greenland, a name meant to attract settlers. When his exile from Iceland ended, he returned and led a colonization fleet west. The Grenlandinga saga records the fleet's size and the founding of the Greenland settlements, at what became known as the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement. Eric established his own farm at Brutality in the Eastern Settlement. He was the founder, the patriarch, the organizing authority of a community that survived at the edge of the known world. He was not a young man by the time his son Leif Erikson began the voyages that would extend Norse exploration to the coast of North America. The Vinland sagas describe Eric as wanting to join the Vinland expedition. The Grenlandinga saga records that on the day he was to depart, he fell from his horse while riding to the ships. He took this as an ill omen. He turned back and did not make the voyage. The account of the horsefall is presented in the saga tradition as the reason he remained in Greenland. Whether this reflects the literal event or a later narrative explanation for why the colony's founder never reached Vinland is not possible to determine from the sources. Leif returned from Vinland. He brought people back with him. Among those who returned, or among the goods and contacts associated with the voyage, came a disease. The Grenlandinga saga states this explicitly. The illness came with those who returned, and it spread through the Greenland colony. Eric the Red fell ill. The colony he had founded, the community he had organized and led, was affected by the same sickness. The sources do not name the disease, do not describe its symptoms in medical terms that can be reproduced here, and do not give a precise timeline for its progression. What the Grenlandinga saga states is that Eric died of this illness. He died in Greenland, in the colony he had created, at approximately the year 1003. He had sailed to the edge of the world, had been expelled from 2 countries, had built a functioning settlement in a place most of the world did not know existed, and had never reached the land his son had found to the west. Eric the Red died in Greenland around 1003. The cause of death, as recorded in the Grenlandinga saga, was the epidemic illness that arrived with the returning Vinland voyagers. Betrayed in Burgundy, Gunnar of Lidarendi, the great warrior of Njál's saga, was killed in his own home in Iceland after refusing to go into exile as the law required, defending himself alone until he could not continue. Gunnar Hamundarson was, by the accounting of Njál's saga, one of the finest fighting men in Iceland. The saga describes his physical attributes in concrete terms: his height, his exceptional abilities with a bow, a spear, and a sword, and his capacity to fight effectively against odds that would have stopped most men. He was admired across the saga's account as a man whose martial qualities were matched by a personal decency that made him distinct from the simply violent men around him. He was a farmer at Lidarendi in the south of Iceland, a man with land and livestock and a place in the community, as well as a reputation that extended far beyond his home district. The sequence of events that led to his death began with the series of disputes that accumulated over years. Njál's saga is in large part an account of how legal and personal conflicts in Iceland's 10th and 11th century society escalated past the point where they could be resolved without violence. Gunnar was drawn into conflicts that were sometimes of his making and sometimes not, and the saga follows how each resolution created new grievances that required new resolutions. Eventually, the Althing, Iceland's legislative and judicial assembly, ruled against him. He was sentenced to outlawry and ordered to leave Iceland for 3 years. He prepared to go. His possessions were arranged. The departure was organized. He rode toward the coast with others who were accompanying him to his ship. Then his horse stumbled and Gunnar was thrown or lost his footing in some accounts, and as he righted himself, he looked back at Lidarendi. The saga records what he said at that moment, attributed directly in the text. The slope had never seemed so beautiful to him, the field so golden, and he said he would not leave. He turned back. His companions understood what this meant. He had violated his sentence. His enemies knew it. His legal protection was gone. The men who held grievances against him organized. They came to Lidarendi. The saga records the attack in detail. Gunnar was inside the house. The attackers surrounded it. He defended from within, using his bow, shooting through gaps in the structure, and held them off with considerable effect. His bowstring broke. He could not continue with the bow. He turned to his wife, Harald, and asked her for 2 locks of her hair, twisted together to restring the bow. She asked him whether his life depended on it. He said it did. She told him she would not give it, and cited an occasion years earlier when he had struck her across the face, following a theft she had arranged. She had remembered, and she had waited. She refused. The quote is from Njál's saga directly, attributed to Haraldr in the text. Without the bow, Gunnar continued to fight. The saga describes him using other weapons, fighting on, but the attackers were many, and the situation was beyond reversing. He was overwhelmed and killed. The saga records the aftermath inside the house, what the attackers found, the account of the fight that spread through the district, and the weight of Haraldr's refusal as one of the defining moments in the entire text. Gunnar of Hlíðarendi was killed at his farm at Hlíðarendi in Iceland. The cause of death was being overwhelmed by multiple attackers after his means of defense were exhausted. The exact date is not recorded as a specific year in the chronicle tradition, but is placed within the saga's late 10th century setting. Burned in the hall. Njál Thorgeirsson, the great legal mind of Njál's saga, was burned alive in his home at Bergþórsval in Iceland alongside his wife and family by a coalition led by Flosi Thordarson in an act of revenge for a killing Njál's son had committed. Njál was not a warrior in the physical sense. He was something rarer in Iceland's saga society, a man whose power came from his understanding of the law. The saga describes him as someone who could see further than others into the consequences of actions, who advised friends and rivals alike on how to navigate disputes, and who had spent decades working to keep violence from spiraling into blood feuds that consumed entire families. He was the kind of man that a violent society produces as a counterweight to itself, and for much of Njál's saga, he functions as exactly that. The events that ended his life began with his son Skarphedinn. Njál's sons were fighters in the way their father was not, and Skarphedinn in particular was volatile and formidable. A dispute involving Flosi Thordarson, a powerful chieftain from the east of Iceland, escalated through the mechanisms the saga documents in careful detail, through failed legal settlements, through insults exchanged at the Althing, through a killing that Njál could neither prevent nor fully resolve. Flosi's kinsman was dead. The settlement offered had been refused or had gone wrong in a way that left Flosi feeling dishonored. He assembled a coalition. The coalition that came to Bergþórsval was large. The Njál saga records the names of those who participated. Flosi led them. They arrived at the farm at night. The saga describes the scene, the farm, the buildings, the layout of the property, the people inside. Njál was inside with his wife Bergþóra, his sons, and his young grandson Thordr. Others in the household were there as well. The saga records that Flosi offered the women and children the chance to leave before the fire was set. Several did leave. Bergþóra was offered the same choice. She refused. The saga records her words. She had been given to Njál young, she said, and she had promised to share whatever fate came to him. She would not leave. The hall was set on fire. The saga describes this in sequence. The fire starting, the spreading, the structure beginning to burn. Those inside attempted various responses. The heat and smoke would have been severe. What the saga records is that Njál and Bergþóra went to their bed and lay down together. An ox hide was placed over them, as described in the text. Njál's sons fought from within the burning hall as long as they could. Skarphedinn and his brothers died in the fire or were killed at the door as they attempted to break out. The saga records the attempts to escape and the deaths of those who tried. When the fire had burned down enough for those outside to enter and examine what remained, they found the bodies of those who had not escaped. The saga records what they found when they reached the place where Njál and Bergþóra had lain. Njál's body, the saga states, was unburned. His body and the space around him showed no sign of the fire's damage in the way the other remains did. The saga presents this as a sign, a marker of the man's character, without speculating on the cause. It is reported here as the saga reports it. The legal consequence followed. The burning was tried at the Althing the following summer. Flosi and his coalition faced prosecution. The case was complex, as cases in Njál's saga always are, moving through procedural maneuvers and counterclaims that fill much of the saga's final section. Flosi was eventually found guilty. He was sentenced to outlawry and went into exile outside of Iceland. Njál Thorgeirsson and his wife Bergþóra were killed in the burning of Bergþórsval. The cause of death was the fire set by Flosi Thordarson's coalition. The deaths of Njál's sons Skarphedinn, Grimr, and Helgi are recorded in the same event, as is the death of the boy Thordr. The exact date within the saga's timeline is not recorded as a precise calendar year. Flosi Thordarson was sentenced to outlawry at the Althing and went into exile following his conviction for the burning. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.